Hi, this is Dr. Parikh, and we're looking at the discussion specifically for the research proposal. There's quite a bit that's different this time. So the first thing that's different is that you've got two different paragraphs here at the beginning. And for your literature review, you did the discussion summary paragraph as one of the very last things. So that was kind of separate from your discussion outline. But now you know everything you've said, and you're refocusing your summary to reflect your hypothesis anyway. So you also will have a longer discussion before you get to limitations, because in the literature review, you are discussing, the literature you've been discussing the whole way through. So there's a little less to say at this point. Whereas for a research proposal, you are restating the purpose and rationale for what you did, and you're also tying your findings, or in this case, your potential findings, back into the literature review that you just wrote. So you're saying how those findings fit in context with everything else you've said. So let's take a little closer look at each paragraph. So first, the summary paragraph. I think I can go a little bigger in here. So this paragraph is really just to recap why you did this study and what your hypothesis was. And if we go back to, let me actually grab from my desktop. Sorry. Burp, burp. Now it even opened up right where I wanted. So if we look back to this Storybooks article example, under discussion, we see this sort of reminder of what's been done before and why it wasn't enough, what the purpose of this study was, and sort of a beginner of what were the main findings. So if we think about your study, we're still a little smaller scale, so you are kind of rephrasing. So it's sort of a topic sentence. It's also a reminder of the purpose of your paper. Hypothesis, reminder, I'm going to have some kind of list. Again, it's brand new, so I might have to experiment and try a few things to find what works. But I will have a clearly labeled list where you can go back and make sure that you're getting the most updated hypothesis. That's the beauty of a Google Doc. So the most up-to-date, same hypothesis every single time. I say present study paragraph here. And then context, you're going to give 1 to 2 sentences talking about what it is. You don't have findings, so instead you're going to talk about just briefly how is this study, why should this study exist in the world. The next paragraph, and you don't need a heading for either of these will just be under discussion, just like I've already minimized it. But if we look at our article here, they talk for quite a while before they get to, actually they don't have any headings at all in their discussion. So the next paragraph is implications. This is where you talk more in depth about what it might mean if your findings are supported. Let's pull up a sample. So I'm going to come back here. Sample papers. Let's see. Because in some ways I think it's easier to just show you here within the context. So you want to say, what could it mean if your hypothesis is supported? So in this case, if athletes who self-identify as perfectionists have greater symptoms of anxiety than athletes who do not self-identify as perfectionists, it conveys evidence of anxiety. It could, I'll keep convey that anxiety is rampant within the sports community. It might I might rewrite that athletes put enormous pressure on themselves. So one thing that I've been moving toward that this sample doesn't show is, so this is all more or less supporting the same So the rationale behind this person's hypothesis was that they really think that athletes who are perfectionists put too much anxiety, like they create anxiety through the pressure that they put on themselves. But I want you to always have at least one idea here that questions your main assumption. So I want you to offer at least one explanation for why you might get this result. And the reason I do this is part of scientific thinking is that we are always looking for other explanations, because when psychologists and scientists assume that they know and that the data could have no other meaning, people get hurt. We have a very dark history in psychology. We don't like to talk about it much, but it's there, particularly with issues like intelligence and autism. They're not the only ones, but they're two really big ones that stand out. With intelligence, psychologists contributed to thinking around racial intelligence differences, because when they gave out IQ scores, they saw different average scores in different racial groups. And they said, well, this racial group must be superior, rather than exploring alternatives like this test may bias information that's more familiar to this racial group, like sports that this racial group is more likely to be exposed to, or educational standards might prepare people in general to take tests. Even if they don't seem like academic tests, they might tap skills that are influenced by formal education, the way we do it in the United States and other places in the Western world. They didn't look at whether environments affect intelligence and testing. So whether having high quality childcare available, having lots of books and toys and other kinds of materials in the home can affect intelligence. And so when you just accept the assumption that, well, the different scores on the tests mean that one group is more intelligent than another, that has a lot of dangerous consequences, because it continues social and legal and economic policies that hurt the, quote, less intelligent, unquote, racial group. Also, this kind of thinking contributed to eugenics, which was the idea that we should sterilize certain people, so not allow them to have children because they were unfit. All of that contributed to Nazi rhetoric. So American psychologists and European psychologists, their work around intelligence, not questioning what other explanations might exist for their findings, contributed to very, very devastatingly harmful ways of thinking. Another example is, and again, these are just a couple examples, there are lots and lots of examples, but early autism expertise they just knew that autism developed from, quote, refrigerator mothers. That was the term used because mothers were so cold and unloving that their children could not attach and develop normally, and instead turned inward. That was the understanding at the time. And part of what happened is that then people would be told the best thing that can happen, the best thing for your child, because you're a refrigerator mother, you are so unloving. The best thing for your child is to be taken out of your care and put in an institution. And these were typically parents who were desperately seeking treatment. So they were not disconnected. They were seeking out treatment for something that nobody knew, nobody had language for what was different about their child. And again, this sense of we just know what's happening We always want to be questioning things because our words and our choices and our interpretation of data affects people, and we want to make sure that we are doing the least harm and the most good possible at any time. So what we could say here instead, we could say something like, alternately, so I want you to always have it, first go ahead and explain what you think is probably happening, but then think of what could be another reason that you would see these results. Alternately, it could be that athletes with, I'm not going to say naturally high, I might say pre-existing high levels of anxiety are likely to become perfectionistic as well. So the initial assumption is that people who identify as perfectionists will, the perfectionism will lead to very high levels of anxiety. That's the sort of the initial assumption. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. But on the flip side, we could say it might be the anxiety that's coming first. It might be that if someone has anxiety from other areas of their life, they will start to become more perfectionistic. Maybe we could say express increased perfectionism as well. I'll move this back to before. Google always says that I mean alternatively. Google's probably right. Google's not always right, but I will accept it at this point. So when we look at this discussion, you want to have, if this happens, it might mean that blah, blah, blah. You also want one that's different. So my example was, if the women exhibit greater levels of PTSD than the men exhibit, then it might mean that women experience more trauma than men experience. It might also mean that women are more likely to develop PTSD than men. And let me add alternatively, because we want to show that these are two different thoughts. So it could be that they experience more trauma. It could also mean that for the same level of trauma, women are more sensitive in some way and more susceptible to PTSD. The next thing, the next part is, so this first part, I just call it interpretation, just to help us talk about the different pieces. The next part I call connection. So you're going to tie your finding back to previous sources. And again, if we pull up this article that we've been looking at from the beginning, we see some kind of very brief interpretation of the findings, and then we see them interpreting further while connecting it to previous findings. So consistent, given that. And then here's just listing information. It may also be explained by the cognitive limitations, and then explains that a little more. So a lot of what the discussion section is doing is explaining the findings in terms of what already exists in the literature. I'd like to see you do that with at least two sources. Sorry, I had to take a quick tea break. So you'd say, would support previous findings, consistent with. I hope that wasn't too loud, sorry. We could also say it could contrast with, it could extend, and you want at least one citation for each sentence. At least two sources total. So I want you connecting it to at least two different sources here in this section. And then theory, here I want you to try to find a bigger picture explanation. And if we go back to our PDF, so here they're still kind of comparing specific storybooks. And then we move into theory. Collectively, these findings are consistent with SAI's 2017 affect valuation theory. And the authors explain that theory and explain how their article or how their findings fit. And they go in quite a bit of depth doing this, and then also still tying it to previous research. One of the downsides is in the literature review, I don't really emphasize theory a lot at this level. And so you may not have a lot of theories. Hopefully, as I've added more sources and sort of opened up what kind of sources you can use, hopefully that gets a little bit easier to find bigger ideas, because theory should be something that's not just a similar finding, but is explaining why something might have happened. One thing that's important to know here is nothing new should be introduced in the discussion section. So especially for theory, you might go beyond what you wrote about in your introduction, and that's okay, but make sure you go back and find somewhere to add that source that main idea about the theory into your introduction, because the discussion should always be tying back to things you've already done. So I want at least one source. It's fine if the theory is the same as one of the two sources you used previously in the paragraph. And again, you can see here we're doing in one paragraph what people take an entire page to do often, an entire published page, which is quite a bit. The next couple parts are a little different, or are similar to what you had before, but you're going to have to completely rewrite them because you need to focus on your new study. There's very little credit I can give for limitations and future research and professional applications that focus on your research, on the articles you discussed in your introduction. Sorry, I did warm-ups and everything, and I'm still very froggy this morning. So topic sentence, as usual, every paragraph should have a topic sentence. It doesn't have to be fancy, just what the focus is here. So limitations, again, if you look at older versions, you might see a separate paragraph for limitations and for future research. I'm trying to make things a little easier, so I'm integrating some of that to cut down on some of the repetition. So I want you to pull out 3 limitations and then follow each one up with a brief sentence about what you could do to improve. Your study is going to be very simple, so there's going to be lots of important variables left out. There may be populations left out. I think it should be pretty easy for you to say what are some things that are holding this study back from being what the literature, everything that the literature needs right now. Professional applications can be a little tough because you have one main finding and you need to think about how to use it in 2 different ways or with 2 very distinct professionals and populations. But hopefully you understand these sections after the introduction, so it should go fairly quickly. And as long as you're making a reasonable effort here, I'm not going to nitpick too much if they're similar. But if you're saying like therapists can do X, school counselors can do X, that's not quite enough differentiation. You need to talk about how different professionals might use that idea a little differently. And as usual, you want to make it very specific to the hypothesis you had. So not just, basic information about how to work with clients with this issue, but really a detail of how would this particular study be helpful to real people. I think that's it for the discussion section. Again, there is no separate template for the research proposal, so you'll just be once you draft these, you're just going to replace the section, the paragraphs that you had. You don't need to add any headings. You'll just have 2 paragraphs instead of 1 here, and then use the previous headings for these 2 sections. I think that's it. Take care. Bye-bye.